Hello, I'm Nate, and I work as an ecologist for the Harris Center. In terms of what I love about the meadows, I love how open meadows are, especially around sunset. We do nighthawk migration surveys, and meadows are great places to do nighthawk surveys. For those of you that might be new to the Harris Center, we are a nonprofit organization based in the Monadnock region of New Hampshire. We help people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, and education for all ages. We've protected more than 25,000 acres of habitat for species that need room to roam, most of which is open for hiking, birding, and other recreation. We also coordinate conservation research on protected lands and throughout the region with a variety of fun community science initiatives. And at the heart of everything we do is education, from babies in backpacks to school programs to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. Speaking of events, we offer over 100 events for the public each year, from film showing to guided hikes to Zoom talks like this one, most of which are free of charge. One event, if you're interested in tagging along with Kate and I, will be leading a mini bio blitz along Bailey Brook at Coolish Ledges this Saturday. You can learn more and sign up for our upcoming events at harriscenter.org. And one thing I'll mention on the bird front is that our Hawkwatch season at Pac Monadnock is starting on September 1st. And Kate, our bird director, our bird conservation director, Phil, and I will be up there any day it's not raining from 9 to 5 if you'd like to visit. This event is also co-sponsored with the Monadnock Conservancy, the Cheshire County Conservation District, and the Windham County Conservation District, where Kate works. And I would encourage folks to check out their websites and some of their upcoming events as well. Speaking of Kate, Kate McKay recently finished her studies at Cornell and has been busy in her short time here in the Monadnock region. Kate has worked for the Harris Center for not one, but three different internships, and last year took on the role of raptor biologist at our Pac Monadnock Raptor Observatory. This spring and summer, Kate has been serving as a seasonal avian technician on the Connecticut River Valley Grassland Bird Project. Her work in Cheshire and Windham counties aims to collaborate with landowners and inform them of management strategies and financial incentives for grassland bird protection, which we look forward to hearing more about tonight. So without further ado, welcome, Kate.
Thanks for the introduction, Nate. Hi, everyone. Glad you could join us tonight. As Nate mentioned, my name is Kate, and I work at the Windham County Natural Resources Conservation District as a seasonal avian technician. If you're not familiar with conservation districts, we're a local municipality focused on providing resources and funding to support local communities. We work a lot with private landowners in agriculture, conservation, environmental education, and other areas. Windham County is over in Vermont, and our office is in Brattleboro, but our grassland bird program that I work on takes place on both sides of the Connecticut River. Just as an overview for tonight, I'll be talking about the history of grasslands in New England and the definition of what a grassland bird is. Then I'll give some background on the species that we focus on here in New Hampshire, and why these birds are declining, their habitat requirements, and how fields can be managed to support them. Finally, I'll talk about the Connecticut River Grassland Bird Project and share what we're doing to help these birds. When many people think of grasslands, they might picture the tall native grass prairies out in central North America, but New England has an interesting story of grasslands. Before the arrival of Europeans in New England, most of this area was covered in forest, and grassland habitats were limited, but still present from natural disturbances such as fire, wind, and beaver activity. For example, when beaver ponds filled in, it created these extensive beaver meadows that grassland birds probably used. And then following European settlement, and mainly during the 1800s, New England forests were cleared for farming, and the landscape became largely open rather than mostly forested. And grassland bird species benefited from this increase in available habitat, and their populations in New England probably reached a peak around the late 1800s. Today, as land use has continued to change, we have seen reforestation taking place in many areas, and the percentage of open field areas and farmland has declined across New England. But at the same time, because we've lost so much of North America's native grasslands out west, New England, with its managed grasslands, now has high potential for grassland bird conservation over the next 100 years. And thus, New England plays an increasing role in sustaining the global population of our grassland birds because we have the opportunity to work with what we have left and make sure the remaining suitable habitat is managed in a way that can support grassland birds. The term grassland bird is often used as a broad category, but we like to make a distinction between birds that might often use grasslands versus birds that actually nest in grasslands. So on the top of the slide here, we have the open country birds. Open country birds are species that are associated with grasslands, but also other habitats. As examples from left to right, we have the eastern bluebird, red-winged blackbird, the American kestrel, barn swallow, and tree swallow. These are all birds that you might see near a field or associate with agricultural settings. They often like to forage in fields, and they could be nesting nearby in a tree or a barn. But you also might see them in other habitats, like a red-winged blackbird nesting in a wetland or a bluebird nesting in your backyard. Then we have the true grassland birds. As opposed to the open country birds, these are species that only use grasslands. They're obligate grassland birds, and they nest directly on the ground in the field. From left to right, as examples of grassland birds, we have the eastern meadowlark, upland sandpiper, bobolink, grasshopper sparrow, and savanna sparrow. There are plenty of other examples, such as the vesper sparrow. This is just a handful of examples, and I'll talk more about a few of these specific species later on. This is a graph showing the population trends of several groups of birds since the 1970s. We can see that a couple groups are increasing, like ducks and water birds, but most of these birds are in decline. And the group of birds that are showing the steepest decline is grassland birds. They are at the very bottom of the list here, which means grassland birds are the fastest declining group of birds in North America. As a group, they've lost 43% of their populations since the late 1900s and are continuing to decline at a rapid rate. In fact, at least 8 species of grassland birds are considered tipping point species. Tipping point species means they've lost more than half of their populations in the past 50 years and are expected to lose what's left within the next 50 years unless we can do something to protect them. This is the eBird status and trends map for the bobolink. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology makes these status and trends maps based on data submitted to eBird. This map shows population trends between 2012 and 2022. Red circles are areas where bobolinks are declining. Blue circles are areas where bobolinks are increasing. And white circles are areas where there's been no change or not enough data to determine a trend. And the darker the color is, the stronger the trend. As we can see, this map really highlights the fact that bobolinks are declining across their entire range, which is true for most of our grassland bird species. In our area, bobolinks have declined by 60 to 70% over the past 50 years. So it's clear that these birds need any help wherever they can get it. So why are grassland birds declining? One of the most important reasons that they're declining so much is the loss of habitat. Grasslands are one of the least protected ecosystems. The Great Plains are in the core range of many grassland bird species, but we've lost over 70% of North America's native prairies and grasslands to row crops. We also have urbanization contributing to the loss of habitat, and as I mentioned before, the reforestation of hayfields in the Northeast. And then our remaining farmland is experiencing increased management intensity. With advances in technology and a changing climate, Farmers are now haying their fields more frequently than they used to, as well as starting to cut earlier in the season. As we know, grassland birds nest on the ground, and so this has just increased the problems they face when they try to nest in our hayfields. As the timing of hay harvesting shifts, it's coinciding more and more with when these birds are nesting, and the challenge is they need those very habitats that also put them at risk. And then finally, pesticides, especially neonicotinoids, are having negative impacts on grassland birds by affecting them both directly and indirectly, and I'll talk more about that in more detail. So those are some of the main threats that grassland birds are facing. One thing to note about grassland birds is that many of them have high site fidelity. This means that many individuals will return to the same field that they've used before. On the left here, we have a savanna sparrow nest with 4 eggs, and on the right, we have a handful of bobolink nestlings. Bobolinks and savanna sparrows are 2 species with high site fidelity. The fact that these birds can find their way back to the same field is pretty impressive, but it can also lead to an ecological trap. An ecological trap is when a species chooses to nest or live in a place because it looks like suitable habitat, but it actually ends up not being a safe place to live, often because of something human caused. An example would be a butterfly laying its eggs on an introduced plant species, but then when the caterpillars hatch, they don't survive because that plant doesn't offer everything that native plants do. For grassland birds, the ecological trap is when the field that they've picked gets cut after they've settled in. And bobolinks only have 1 nest per season. So when a field gets cut, they usually don't have enough time to re-nest, and they will just not have young that year. But because of their high site fidelity, they might keep coming back to that field to try again the next year, even though the field keeps getting cut. And eventually, this can lead to a population sink for the birds in that area because they can't reproduce successfully, even though they might keep trying. If that field keeps getting cut, it doesn't work out. Neonicotinoids are the most widely used insecticide in the world, and their main use is as seed coatings in agriculture. Millions of acres of corn and soybeans are planted every year with coated seeds. However, as much as 97% of the chemical leaves the seed, and once in the soil and water, neonics can kill non-target organisms, including birds, pollinators, and insects that birds need. A single seed is enough to kill a songbird, and in smaller amounts, it impairs their navigation skills and has other harmful effects. It's estimated 72 million birds are killed by pesticides every year. The good news is that the American Bird Conservancy has funding available to help farmers transition away from treated seeds and find better alternatives. Their untreated seed program pays farmers per acre of corn to reduce the use of neonic treated seeds. And it's worth mentioning that cornfields also do not provide nesting habitat. Unlike hayfields, you won't see birds nesting in cornfields. Now we're going to dive into the ecology and life histories of a few grassland bird species around here, starting with the bobolink. This is probably the grassland bird that many of you are most familiar with. The males are the ones you're most likely to notice. They are boldly patterned with white on the back and black on the belly. This dark below and light above is unique among North American songbirds, so they're fairly easy to identify. They're often described as wearing a backwards tuxedo. And they fly above the grass while singing at the same time, which makes them even easier to spot. Meanwhile, the females tend to spend more time in the grass, and they look a lot like sparrows with their brown and buff colors. In late summer, the male will actually molt into a plumage similar to the female. Bobolinks undergo 2 complete molts per year, which is uncommon among birds. In the summer, a bobolink's diet consists mostly of insects, spiders, and snails, and they also feed their young a high-protein diet of caterpillars and other insects. I've learned that they really like praying mantises. When I was out doing fieldwork this summer, I would often see a female carrying back a big beak full of praying mantises to the chicks. In the winter, bobolinks will eat more seeds, and they enjoy eating weed seeds, such as dandelions, in the spring. The details of the bobolink's nesting biology is important for our discussion of how to manage fields in a way that's bird friendly. This is a very handy nesting calendar from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. Basically, male bobolinks arrive back in New England in early May, with the females arriving about a week later. In fact, bobolinks are sometimes called the May bird because of how they like to arrive right around the 1st of May. Nest building and egg laying begins in late May. Bobolinks lay an average of 5 eggs, and they only raise one brood a year. The month of June is one of the most important times for nesting birds because it's the main nesting period when the females are incubating their eggs and both parents are feeding nestlings. In early July, nests begin fledging young who still can't fly for up to 10 days after leaving the nest. By mid-July, many young birds have fledged, with more able to fly each day. And the picture on the left shows what a bobolink nest looks like. Their eggs are gray with brown speckling. The bobolink's migration is one of the most remarkable things about them. Bobolinks make one of the longest trips of any migrant songbird in the country. On the range map here, orange is the bobolink's breeding range. After they're done nesting, they gather into flocks by late July and August, often feeding in marshes, including coastal marshes, where they need to spend several weeks getting ready for their long migration. Yellow is their migration route, so they can fly right over the Gulf on their way down to their wintering grounds in southern Brazil and northern Argentina. They migrate mostly at night, using the Earth's magnetic field and the night sky to navigate. Once in South America, bobolinks like to feed in rice fields during the winter. In fact, their Latin name means rice eating. They will also spend the winter in other field habitats, grasslands, and marshes. Their spring migration back north begins in late March, with older birds often arriving on the breeding grounds first. Altogether, bobolinks make a round trip of about 12,000 miles. And over its lifetime, an individual bobolink could travel the equivalent of 4 or 5 times around the circumference of the Earth. This is a flock of bobolinks in Florida on their way down to South America. This picture was taken during the month of September. We can sometimes get large flocks in New England at the end of the breeding season, but this flock is literally thousands of bobolinks, which is pretty cool. During migration, they will feed and roost together in these big flocks. Our second focus species is the eastern meadowlark. Meadowlarks are these beautiful bright yellow and brown colored birds with a black crescent across their chest and distinctive white outer tail feathers when you see them flying. Males and females look alike, although the males are slightly larger and often have more yellow than the females. They are a lot less widespread than the bobolink and have seen one of the sharpest declines of any grassland bird. Their population in our area has declined by more than 95% over the past 50 years. In the Connecticut River Valley, there are only a small handful of sites left where meadowlarks still attempt to nest. Meadowlarks have a beautiful song that means spring has arrived. They start returning in March as soon as the snow melts, and they start nesting in late April, and the young fledge in late June, which means that they can fledge their first nest sooner than bobolinks. Males usually have 2 females in their nesting territory, and meadowlarks are rather quick to abandon their nest if they're disturbed during incubation or nest building stages. Meadowlarks are found across the east. They winter and some of them live year-round in the southeast. And their whole range extends down through Central America to northern South America. There are subspecies down there that don't migrate. The ones in New Hampshire are migratory, but they will remain further north in warmer winters. Meadowlarks are on the state threatened list in both New Hampshire and Vermont. There are probably less than 100 left in Vermont and even less than that in New Hampshire. The grasshopper sparrow is the last of the 3 priority species that our project focuses on. They are named for their unusual song that sounds like a grasshopper, although they also love to happen to eat grasshoppers along with crickets, caterpillars, beetles, and other insects in the summer, and they eat more seeds in the wintertime. To identify a grasshopper sparrow, look for a buff-colored sparrow with a kind of flat-headed appearance. They have no streaks on the front, and they have an orange-yellow spot above the eye and a short tail. They are a late migrant compared to bobolinks and meadowlarks, often arriving in the middle of May. Grasshopper sparrows prefer slightly different habitat characteristics than the bobolink, often nesting in areas with thinner vegetation and more patches of bare ground. They build an ovenbird-like domed nest on the ground and can raise two broods per season. Grasshopper sparrows generally migrate in late September or August. They live across the east and Midwest in the summer, as well as parts of the far west, and they spend the winter in the southern US, Mexico, Cuba, and other parts of the Caribbean. Grasshopper sparrows are also state threatened in New Hampshire and Vermont. One last species I'd like to mention is the savanna sparrow. They are the most widespread and abundant of the grassland birds I've talked about, and they are more likely to re-nest when their first nest gets destroyed, and they can also nest more easily along the edges of fields, making them less of a concern from a management standpoint than bobolinks and meadowlarks. Savanna sparrows look like your typical sparrow, but they have fine streaking on the front and yellow above the eye. They have a buzzy song that you often hear when they arrive back in March. They have up to 4 broods a season, and savanna sparrows are a good indicator of grassland habitat. If you see a savanna sparrow in your field, it often means that habitat could potentially also be suitable for bobolinks or other grassland birds. Savanna sparrows eat insects, other invertebrates, and also seeds, and even berries such as wild strawberries and blueberries. There are a couple of lookalike species that are often confused for grassland birds. We have a female red-winged blackbird on the left and a song sparrow on the right. Female red-winged blackbirds are often seen near hayfields and might be mistaken for female bobolinks. But some good ways to tell them apart is that the red-winged blackbird is a darker brown color overall. It has a longer bill, and it shows dense streaking on the front. For the song sparrow, they are slightly larger than our grassland sparrows and do not have any color above the eye. They also have coarser streaks than the savanna sparrow and a relatively longer tail. Now let's look at the habitat requirements of grassland birds. When a bobolink or other bird like this grasshopper sparrow is looking for a place to nest, there are a number of things that are important to them. These include the size of the field, shape of the field, vegetation characteristics within the field, and even the surrounding landscape. All of these factors play a role in whether you'll have grassland birds in your field or not, and I'll go through each one in more detail. So first, the acreage of a field is pretty important for a lot of grassland bird species. This represents a very large field that could support several different grassland birds at the same time. And one of the grassland birds that need this type of field is the upland sandpiper. Upland sandpipers only nest in fields that are about 100 acres or more in size. They are what's called an area-sensitive species. Obviously, there are not too many fields of that size in our area, and as a result, upland sandpipers are very rare around here. Next, we have the minimum area that eastern meadowlarks and grasshopper sparrows need. If a field is close to 60 acres or more in size, then it has higher potential to support these species. Once again, that's a pretty large field, and it's one of the reasons why airports have become one of the few places left where these area-sensitive species can still exist. There's a lot of open space at airports, and we actually work with airports to try and support the grassland birds that they have. The vesper sparrow, a grassland bird that I've only briefly mentioned, also needs a fair bit of land. They need fields of at least 15 acres in size. But vesper sparrows are pretty rare in New Hampshire and not usually found in this area. Finally, we have the bobolink. They do best in fields that are at least 10 acres in size. Bobolinks will sometimes nest in fields smaller than that if other conditions are right. I think the smallest field I've seen the nesting in was like 5 acres. But like other grassland birds, the bigger the field, the better it is for supporting the most bobolinks. Next, we have field shape. The two fields here are the same size. They are both about 30 acres, so they could definitely support bobolinks based on their size. But one field is round and the other field is long and narrow. Grassland birds have what's called the center of the field preference, where they like to nest in the middle of the field to avoid field edges. They want to have an open sight line to have a better lookout for predators. So a field that is really long and narrow or in some odd shape will have a lot of edge habitat and therefore will be much less ideal for nesting, although grassland birds might still use that field for feeding. Grassland birds are going to prefer round or square fields where they can nest in the center away from the edge. In this picture, although the blue field might still have one or two nests, we'd expect the yellow field to have more bobolinks, even though the two fields are the same size. Now, what about the vegetation structure and composition within a field? So on the left here, we have a picture of a field that represents a classic hay field that gets cut 2 to 4 times a season. Although attractive to grassland birds, this field is managed with too many cuts for them to be able to nest because the grass is kept too short. In the middle, we have what I would call a bobolink field. This could be a hayfield or meadow where there are only about 1 or 2 cuts a season, and so grassland birds have time to finish nesting. Even though the vegetation is the same, the grass is taller and provides shelter for nesting. Grassland birds prefer these nice grass-dominated fields, usually non-native grasses around here. There might be some legumes like clover or some wildflowers and other forbs, herbaceous flowering plants other than grass. Around 30% flowering plants is a good maximum for a field to have and still be grassy enough for most grassland birds like the bobolink. On the right, we have a field that gets cut even less frequently, but the vegetation is no longer attractive to grassland birds. This field only gets cut once every 1 to 4 years. It's got a lot more wildflowers, goldenrods. We also see some woody plants and saplings coming in as well. This type of field is not suitable for most grassland birds, although it will be great habitat for other species like the field sparrow. And once a field is managed even less than that, like it gets cut every 5 to 15 years, then it becomes a shrubland, and you would expect to see birds like the eastern towhee or blue-winged warbler. So older fields won't have grassland bird habitat, but they can be great for other species. The last main factor that determines where grassland birds nest is what the surrounding landscape looks like. Here we have 2 fields. The one on the left is about 30 acres, and the one on the right is only about 15 acres. However, grassland birds are going to prefer the smaller field in this case because of what the nearby landscape looks like. As you can see, the field on the left is surrounded by forest, but the field on the right is within a patchwork of other fields and agricultural areas. The more open a landscape is, the better it is for grassland birds. So grassland birds are going to pick the field on the right over the field that is isolated by itself because that field on the right is within a much more open landscape. Now that we have a background on who these birds are, when they nest, and where they like to nest, we can move on to management strategies that incorporate all that info to support these birds. Field management often starts with monitoring the site to see if grassland birds are present, and if so, what species are using the field. We also want to take into account all the available options and what the habitat looks like for each one. And so field management often involves looking at the big picture and prioritizing different fields or areas within a field to make sure the management will yield the most benefit for grassland birds. Finally, the most important part of field management is simply adjusting the mowing schedule to allow grassland birds enough time to nest. For delayed mowing, there are 2 main methods or timelines to consider if you want to protect grassland bird habitat. We typically recommend delaying until after July 15th, This will give many bobolinks the chance to successfully fledge young and for the young to be able to fly away when the field does get cut. This method is usually the most ideal way to delay mow, and it's what most landowners who manage for grassland birds practice. But sometimes farmers, especially dairy farmers, have a hayfield that they need to cut before July in order to get the proper high quality grass for their livestock. And so an alternative haying schedule would be to take a first cut before May 20th and then wait 65 days before taking a second cut, which would be after July 24th. This allows for a cut of high quality forage early in the season while still giving some birds enough time to fledge young. After delayed mowing, mowing patterns or how a field gets cut is important to consider. Adjusting mowing patterns and adopting better mowing strategies can help reduce the impact of mowing on grassland birds. The way to cut a field with birds in mind is to mow either back and forth across the field or mow from the inside out. This is because mowing towards unmowed areas helps offer young birds a chance to escape into a safer area. What you don't want to do is start at the edge and mow around inwards, because that might trap birds in the middle. This is especially important if a field is getting cut close to July 15th and young birds haven't developed their flight skills yet. Sometimes the difference of just a day or two could mean the difference of whether young birds are able to fly or not. And really, even a small delay in mowing during peak nesting season can make a big difference for grassland birds. Another strategy is to avoid mowing after sunset because grassland birds, both the young and the adults, are more vulnerable when they're roosting. One question that I get asked a lot about is, what about grazing? Up until now, we've only talked about the mowing and haying of fields. For livestock, it really depends on the density of the animals and how much time they spend grazing the field. The chance of nest trampling is low if there's not too many animals and they move frequently. Grassland birds evolved with bison out west, and they coexist because bison move around and are only in an area for a short time. So some rotational grazing systems can also support grassland birds if they are done in the right way. Invasive plants are becoming more of a management concern for grassland bird habitat in recent years. Examples include spotted knapweed, smooth bedstraw, poison parsnip, and yellow rattle, which is what the yellow flower here is. Leaving fields until after the birds are done nesting can sometimes help allow invasive species to increase, and the problem is that these invasive plants can reduce habitat quality for the birds after they become established. A lot of fields have these plants, and the need for management will depend on the density of their growth. So there's a couple different options that are used to help manage invasive species. One solution is targeted management, where you keep an eye out for invasives and act quickly when you see them to prevent them from spreading. You can do this by mapping out where they are in the field and then targeting just those sections with mowing so that the invasive plants don't go to seed and the birds still have undisturbed areas to nest. Another management recommendation would be to maintain a mowed path around the field to sort of act as a moat. This path can help reduce the encroachment of invasive or woody plants into the interior of the field, which is the best nesting habitat. Another method to keep down invasive plants would be to try mowing early in May, if it still allows enough time for grass to regrow and the bobolinks to return. Cutting in May works well in some areas, but not others, depending on the elevation and the environmental conditions of the area. And then, if needed, mowing rotations can be really helpful. So if you have a field that's just covered with invasives, you could manage intensively for them in a quarter or a half of the field, and then the next year rotate to a new area. This lets you control invasives in the summer while still leaving habitat for grassland birds to nest. Biologists used to recommend delayed mowing until August 15th. And one of the reasons we now recommend July 15th is because of how invasive plants are starting to increase if fields are left too long. We want to wait long enough for the birds to fledge, but not long enough that it reduces habitat quality. Our program, the Connecticut River Valley Grassland Bird Project, is a local opportunity to get assistance with supporting grassland birds on your fields. The program is relatively new. We started last year when we got a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The project is a partnership with other conservation districts in the area. So we work with landowners in 4 different counties, Windham and Windsor on the Vermont side of the river, and Cheshire and Sullivan on the New Hampshire side. This is a map showing some of the sites in the program this year. We've had an increase from last year, but we're always looking for more interest from the New Hampshire side of the river within the Monadnock region. The Grassland Bird Project provides farmers and landowners both technical and financial assistance to manage for grassland birds. We conduct free site visits to document the presence of grassland bird species, the number of individuals, and their nesting progress. By monitoring when the young fledge, we can also clear fields for mowing as early as possible. We provide technical support and offer management recommendations, and we also offer financial assistance to farmers who are able to give nesting birds the time they need. The financial incentives range from 1 to 3,000, depending on size of the field, habitat quality, number of birds, and the surrounding landscape. In our area, there are a couple of other options to get funding for delayed mowing practices, including the Bobolink project and the Natural Resources Conservation Service Environmental Quality Incentives Program. If you want to learn more, you can look up those programs online. Our program is a bit different and offers more flexibility. There are no deadlines or minimum acreage requirements. The area set aside for delayed mowing could just be 10 acres in the middle of a field or 2 acres around a meadowlark nest. Unlike the other programs where payments are per acre, our program offers financial incentives by farm. There are also no contracts. The farmer isn't committing to tying up the land for a number of years. So our program is really designed to be much more flexible and simple. We recognize that every field is different and landowner constraints are also going to be different. So our program is not one size fits all. Rather, we provide customized assistance based on the specific site. Our management recommendations depend on what the habitat looks like, what the landowner is able to do, and what the landowner's goals are. We try to find a balance between grassland bird protection and the needs of the farmer or landowner by visiting the sites in person to meet with them one-on-one, having a conversation to discuss their goals and needs, and then coming up with a sort of compromise that protects the best bobolink habitat while still working out for the landowner. For a short summary of how our 2026 season went, we've worked with dozens of landowners across the 4 counties and protected many grassland birds, including hundreds of bobolinks. For meadowlarks, a highlight was protecting their nests at 4 different sites. Volunteer Kat Abbott worked with those farmers, and they all agreed to delay mow around the meadowlark nests. This is a picture she took of a meadowlark fledgling from one of those sites in our program. Overall, we've conserved more than 420 acres of habitat for grassland birds this year. To tie together management strategies and recommendations we've talked about, I'll now share an example of a site in our program and the compromise we reached with the landowner. This is the site. There are 2 fields and they're 40 acres combined. The landowner was eager to protect the bobolinks, but he also wanted to be able to use the land as a hayfield or pasture. So we needed to identify the best area to prioritize for any management efforts, since leaving the whole area wasn't a good option. One of the tools we like to use is mapping field openness. This map shows how open the field areas are with yellow being more open and blue being less open. As we talked about before, more open is better for grassland birds. So this map highlights the best bobolink habitat. So then, based on the map and field surveys of where the bobolinks are, we came up with a management plan for the landowner. The yellow areas are flagged out for the bobolinks. There is one in each field, and each bobolink area is about 5 acres. The landowner will leave those until July 15th, but he can cut or graze the outside areas anytime. So this is an example of kind of working around the edges and finding something that works for everyone. If you want to see more examples of conservation on farms, I would recommend our Birding on the Farm workshop series, along with Cheshire County Conservation District, the Monadnock Bird and Nature Club, and other organizations. We host these bird walks at various farms throughout the area. It's a great chance to visit farms and see what they're doing to protect birds and other wildlife right on their properties. There are lots of benefits from protecting grassland birds. Grassland birds consume many agricultural pests, making them a great for natural pest control. Delayed mowing is also great for soil health and supports pollinators, which can then help pollinate crops and other plants. All of this contributes to more ecosystem services and builds a resilient food web, increasing stability. Basically, a lot of things are connected with grassland birds. One of the things I've learned doing this type of work is just how much life hayfields can support. These are all pictures I've taken in hayfields. There are often lots of other birds around. We've got a Wilson snipe up in the corner here. I always see lots of butterflies, dragonflies, and bees while I'm walking through fields in the program. There's also surprisingly a lot of plant diversity too, different types of flowers and even orchids. In the bottom right, we have a ragged fringed orchid growing in a hayfield that the landowner left for the birds. So delayed mowing is a benefit to a much broader array of wildlife than just bobolinks and meadowlarks. Bobolinks are kind of an umbrella species where protecting their habitat will also contribute to the protection of other species too. Before we wrap up, I wanted to note that farmers are a big reason we have bobolinks and other grassland bird species in the Northeast. Without farms, hayfields would revert back to forest, and many grassland birds would have less suitable habitat. Many farmers are interested in supporting birds. A lot of them care about birds, and our program aims to help them out as they try to manage their fields. I would encourage you to support your local farmers. That's all for this evening. I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
That was awesome, Kate. Thank you so much. One thing I found really interesting was you talking about in South America, bobolinks use rice fields, because up here I've actually noticed them in migration. They'll congregate in wild rice, which grows in marshes and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We did have a couple questions. This might be reiterating some of the things that you mentioned. Um, so one person had asked when it's safe to hay or mow a meadow in the Upper Valley. It sounds like late July is probably that window.
Yes. Yep. After July 15th, typically works for much of New England area.
Okay. And then just to reiterate, when is it safe for cattle grazing?
That's a good question too. As I kind of said, it depends on, how many animals, what kind type of animals, and how often they're moved. If you have enough of a field, you could leave areas in the middle to kind of save to last and have the cattle graze around the edge. Or you could, if there's not that many animals, try just having them in there and seeing if it works with the bobolinks, depending on what type of grassland birds you have.
Great. Thanks. I would just mention for folks, if you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Um, I had a question that so a lot of farm fields, you mentioned when there's mosaics, it does make for more productive grassland bird habitat. I was
Hmm.
curious about like within a single grassland, how much do hedgerows impact bird usage? Like, do they really want it super open, does a row of trees have a significant impact there? Or
Yeah, great question. Hedgerows are typically considered not ideal for grassland birds, but grassland birds always surprise me. They'll be in a habitat that I don't think is good for birds, or they'll be this great habitat that looks great and they won't be there. So I have seen them nesting in fields that has like a hedgerow that kind of splits the field in half, and they didn't seem to mind. Um, but oftentimes like roads or hedgerows will be kind of like an obstruction to their sight line, and we'll often have less birds versus a field that is just entirely open. There's no trees in the way, things like that.
gotcha, thank you. Michelle, you had a question. I don't know if you wanted to ask it or I can read your question.
Yeah, I can ask. So I was curious about have bobolinks where I live, and I see them hanging around past late July. So I was wondering when they migrate, and then the other side of that, if a field is hayed late July
Mhm.
and the birds are young, uh, but can fly, what happened? Where do they go after the haying happens?
Yeah, good question. So bobolinks will they gather into flocks as soon as they're done nesting. One of the ways that we tell that they're done with a field is we'll start seeing family groups. And they'll move to the edges of fields or go to like more wet areas. So you'll see them in marshes and wetlands, after they're done nesting. And so that's kind of where most of them go. They generally spend a lot of time feeding in those areas, so they'll still be around in August and September, but then their numbers will get less as they start on their migration back to South America. Yeah.
Thanks.
We did have a question from John asking if there are any resources you recommend for learning more about grassland bird ecology and migration.
Yes, yeah, there are several resources I would recommend. Probably one of the most useful ones would be the website All About Birds. It's got info on the ecology of birds. It has a bunch of maps and pictures as well. And if you want to dive deeper, the has links to Birds of the World, which is life histories of a bunch of different bird species, and has these great accounts of the behaviors and other parts of the bird's life cycle. I would also recommend our website, the Windham County Natural Resources Conservation District. We have a page on grassland birds and links to the Vermont Center of Eco Studies, which do a similar type of work. Those would also be great resources for learning more.
Great. Um, did have a question from Pat about how do you go about finding nests?
Nests are super hard to find. I've only found a bobolink nest once. Oftentimes they just rely on blending in. They're just like nesting in a sea of grass, and so they just rely on that camouflage, and it works really well. They're also usually like tuck grass over their nest too, so even if you're standing like right above a nest, it can still be very hard to spot. A lot of grassland birds are also very secretive when they're nesting. Grasshopper sparrows, for example, when the female leaves the nest, she'll run through the grass a little bit before flying up, making it even more difficult to locate their nests. And so we don't really spend too much time trying to find nests, but rather finding the best habitat where the nests are. Um, because, yeah, grassland birds are like one of the hardest birds to find the nests of.
Yeah, one thing I would mention, Pat, is if you do think you have grassland birds on your property, one thing to look out for during the breeding season is specific behaviors. So if you are seeing birds that appear agitated, they're flying around you and calling and things like that, there probably is a nest nearby. And I would recommend not trying to find the nest because you could accidentally trample it or something like that. I've been in fields and had bobolinks flush, and I just kind of got out of the area. We had a kind of a more specific question. So, someone is using triclopyr, which is a pesticide for cut stump application on woody invasives. Um, Do you see any negative impacts to future nesting after treatment once they reclaim the area?
That's a good question. In the long term, management for invasives will generally be good for grassland birds because it's making the habitat better for them. It's increasing the habitat quality. In the short term, intensive management like spraying or cutting, frequent cutting, is negative for grassland birds. But hopefully, if the management works well, then the birds will return. I don't know too much about that specific pesticide and whether or not it impacts birds in other ways than that, but it sounds like the birds should return if once it takes place.
Cool. Well, it looks like we have no other questions in the chat, so I would just say thank you very much for educating us on grassland birds. It was really informative, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks,
So
Nate. Thanks
thanks,
everyone
Kate.
for joining.